Good afternoon from Columbus, Ohio, which is the traditional homelands of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandotte, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. I'm Stephen John Quaye, and I'm an associate professor in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program at The Ohio State University. Thank you so much for joining us for the first conversation in the ASHE Presidential Webinar Series, convened by current ASHE President D.L. Stewart. This webinar is being captioned live, and those captions can be accessed by clicking the CC button in your menu bar. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the ASHE website in the next week. Throughout the webinar, you can pose questions to the panelists by using the Q&A feature in the menu bar. They may answer questions throughout as they come in or at the end. We enter this webinar knowing that people with dominant identities and in positions of power continue to enact violence on minoritized people. I want to acknowledge the anti-Asian racist violence that has a long history and yet has increased over the past year in quantity and violence. We also enter this space following the guilty verdict of the trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer who killed George Floyd last year, and also with continued efforts across many states to prevent trans people from living as their full selves. And as we also know, we are still in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic that disproportionately impacts Black and Brown people. The purpose of the ASHE Presidential Webinar Series is to engage leaders on critical issues related to space and place in higher education. Let me distinguish between place and space. According to Eric Jacobson, places are imbued with memories and experiences, whereas spaces are blank states that have yet to be transformed into places and may, in fact, never morph into places. Places help us develop our identities, but spaces give us the space, so to speak, to reflect on what is possible with our identities. We need both places and spaces. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted students' conceptual spaces and physical places where they learn about themselves and others. In many cases, those who work in cultural centers kept these places and spaces open and worked to recreate these spaces and places virtually. In this first webinar, I invited 4 leaders who work in cultural centers and have done research on the need for these centers, perhaps now more than ever. Toby Jenkins is currently the Interim Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Graduate School at the University of South Carolina. She's also an Associate Professor of Higher Education in the College of Education. Her work has explored the role of cultural education in the lives of college students and the strategic management of cultural centers. Dan Darko is the Assistant Director for the Miller Center for Student Disability Services and adjunct instructor in the Disability Studies program at Miami University. His experience includes working in residence life and advancing disability access, where he views disability as a powerful identity and recognizes the socio-political nature of claiming disability. Dre Domain is the Assistant Dean of Students at Davidson College and the Vice President of ACPA, College Student Educators International. In this role, she works with historically minoritized students and oversees the Center for Diversity and Inclusion in the College Union, the Spencer Weinstein Center for Community and Justice, and the Lavender Lounge for LGBTQ students in Belk Residence Hall. She also advises the Black Student Coalition's House. And finally, Alonso Reyna Rivarola is the Assistant Director for Diversity and Multicultural Affairs at Salt Lake Community College, where he works with undocumented students. Active on Twitter, he also uses this medium to highlight undocumented students' needs and experiences. Thank you all for joining us. I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation. Before I pose the first question, I want to ask each panelist to briefly say hello, recognize where you are joining from, and share anything you want us to know about you and your work. Let's start with you, Alonso.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen. Hi, my name is Alonso again, and my pronouns are él and him. I am tuning in from Eastern Shoshone and Goshute land, or Salt Lake City, Utah, as settlers know it. I am a queer undocumented immigrant, and I'm really open about my status because I think it's important for people to know how the states continue to illegalize people in this country, and I am merely one of 11 million. So in my work, I try to really center undocumented perspectives, right? And those are varied. There is no such thing as the undocumented experience. A lot of people try to make it a singular event, but it's not. So I really try to center those perspectives, both in my work in scholarship, but also with students. Again, I have the honor of serving as the assistant director for the Office of Diversity and Multicultural Affairs. And in May, I'll be starting an interim role as the director of admissions here on campus. So I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much. Dre, how about you?
Everybody, my name is Dre Domain. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm coming from the ancestral land of the Catawba and the Shukri people just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm a Southerner, so I am returning home to the South. A lot of my work was done in the Northeast, in New England in particular. So this is like a homecoming, being back at Davidson. I have spent my entire career basically working in a variety of identity-based centers, starting with LGBT to a women's center to Multicultural International. And so now at Davidson, one reason why I decided to come back, I get to do all of it in one job. And it has been a lifelong goal to figure out how to do this work in an intersectional framework. I think we talk about that from a theory. And so actually having my hands in the ground to do that on campus has been a big life's work for me. I'm also grappling with doing this work in the South at a predominantly white college with a very deep-rooted history of displacement of Indigenous people, but also literally a campus built by slavery. And so that's very much on my mind as I'm navigating my work every day.
Thank you, Dre, for that. Toby, you're up.
Sure. So greetings, Toby Jenkins, she, her pronouns. So I bring you greetings from Columbia, South Carolina, and I am also returning home to the South. Columbia is my hometown. And after I'm here, back here after 20 years of being away, working and studying, et cetera. But the land on which the University of South Carolina, where I work, operates is the traditional and native land of the Congaree tribe. After fighting against the colony of South Carolina in the Yamasee War of 1715, over half of the Congaree were killed or enslaved. And those that remained, they went on, they traveled further north to join the Catawba. We also acknowledge that in the more recent past, the land on which the university operates was home to a large African-American community, and that community is dear to me. It's the communities that my parents came from. The infrastructure of that community included businesses, churches, schools, and homes that serve the social, the educational, economic, spiritual needs of Black Colombians, and all of those things are no longer exist. And so we acknowledge that the displacement of multiple cultural communities has occurred on this land. I share this more extended kind of land acknowledgement because much of my work, and I would venture to say probably all of our work, is about making space to fully include our truth, our histories, our people, our ways of knowing and thinking and being, doing, right? And that might mean giving more time, more resources, more effort, more physical space for all of these things to exist. I also share it to remind us that when we ask for this physical and intellectual space of our campuses to transform, we aren't asking for too much. We are asking for our cultural homes back. And so it's thank y'all for the invitation. It's an honor and pleasure to be included in this webinar.
Thank you, Toby. I very much appreciate that introduction and the extended lane acknowledgement that you gave as well. I appreciate that. Dan, what about you?
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Dan Darko. I use he, him pronouns. Thank you for the invitation this afternoon. I identify as a disabled white male wheelchair user with short brown hair, and I'm currently wearing a blue polo. Today, I'm joining everybody from a in Oxford, Ohio, where the live and work here, which are on the ancestral homelands of the Miamia and Shawnee people. I think about moving beyond the recognition of the land acknowledgement that I occupy and the forced labor that created this institution, because I do disability work. And in disability work, it's intrinsically connected with race. When we think about disability and the intersection between disability and race, both of these ideas have constructed our societal understanding of each other, and disabled folks, Indigenous folks know disability well and know the medical industrial complex very well. And all of these pieces are tied together. So I did want to mention that. And outside of my work at Miami University, I am an advocate for the disability community, working on advancing disability access and understanding from the cultural perspective of disability. Looking forward to engaging with everyone this afternoon. I've had some great conversations with a graduate student, a colleague in Floyd who I've been working with, and really excited for the conversation we all are going to have today.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate those introductions to give our listeners in the audience a sense of where you're coming from and the attachment to the land and the folks who built through slavery many of the places in which we're situated. So I just really appreciate the way in which you all introduce yourselves. So let's get to the first question. I would love it if each of you would talk about how your work has shifted, specifically during COVID-19. So what has changed and how are you and the students holding up in the midst of these shifts? Dre, let's start with you.
Thanks, Stephen. Let's start with how we're doing. Not great, I'll be honest. We were chatting as panelists beforehand. It's been a year, y'all. It's been a year in every way possible, from not only pandemic, from mental health to all the things Stephen had mentioned to open things up. And so real talk, even this week has been heavy. And I think for me, and as well as the students that I work with, it shows up in how our campus in different ways, right? I've navigated students that are isolated, lonely, want to be in their rooms, just want to wrap it up, a little apathy, to activism is still happening as early as Monday. I got my demands from students. So it's all over the place. And so how has my work changed? In short, the way I describe it is a couple things. Just because a pandemic happened doesn't mean the work of equity has paused or stopped. If anything, I think the pandemic has exacerbated things that were already bubbling on my campus in a lot of different ways. For us, the context of Davidson is that we made the decision to close our campus in part 4 days after we came back from spring break. So students had just come back. So a lot of my early work was the transition home. And that was hard financially for many of our students. I work with a lot of first-gen undocumented students. And so finding the funds to help students get home, they did not plan to go back home so early, where their stuff was going to be, how to the technology to even access the classes, were a lot of the early things that I was doing. The benefit of me having work in ACPA virtually as a leader for many years is that I knew how to do virtual gathering and organizing. So I brought that hat to my campus very quickly. And so the pivot to go into virtual, we decided to use Zoom a lot, and social media was easy for me personally and my staff. But I do think our students were caught in this space of, grieving and kind of figuring out the unknown. And I really had a hard time getting to imagine the possibilities of us being in virtual. Over time, I have seen that shift. There are things, because of my physical spaces on campus, we're constrained by walls and buildings that we can now do differently. So for example, when I'm working with my queer and trans students, I can have a variety of different spaces for them happening at the same time, rather than having like one day here, one day there. We can do a lot more that we weren't able to do. But there's something different when you're at a small liberal arts college built on interpersonal that gets lost in the virtual world. And that's we were kind of struggling through. So that's a short answer of saying that we're in this space now of returning back to space, back to campus, back to places. For some of our students, they've never even seen any of my spaces. There literally are some of my students that are, all over the country right now. And so trying to figure out how to bring them into a history, but also a different type of history since everything has happened is kind of what's on my mind right now.
Thank you so much for that, Dre. And I also just want to especially extend my gratitude for your honesty and just saying that it's been a struggle. You're not how you used to be, right? Like you're not okay. And I think it's many of us are not okay right now. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. So I just want to, again, express my gratitude for your truth there and for your honesty. Dan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo everything that Dre shared and say that in the world of accessibility work and disability, it was a quick pivot, one that we couldn't leave our disabled students behind when their access was required. So how are we moving from our physical places to our virtual spaces? And I think that is something where many disability offices and students were really engaging and understanding how an extremely individualized approach for many of our students and their access needs needed to be met. And for some students, that was a really easy transition. And for other students, that was extremely challenging. I think we aren't giving enough weight to that in the back and forth that many of our students have had to experience over the time. And I think that's one thing that I would touch on there. I would also add for students that have lost structure, that has been many of our students feel like they're swimming in autonomy and can't figure this out because they're losing direction and the sense of community that they had in their physical places, but now in the virtual space, some of that is lost. And then we have across disability, a wide spectrum where many students who identify as disabled are thriving in the virtual space that they've never been able to thrive before because the physical spaces were so confining and so limiting in terms of their access. So that's absolutely a spectrum where students are experiencing the pandemic very differently. But our place is seeing an increase. We know that there's increasing students that are having psychological diagnoses and disabilities as a direct result of the pandemic. So all of these combining experiences are increasing the work of disability on campus. And finally, looking at how are we engaging in our space as we return to campus, as was shared. I think our return to campus, when we look at them in a critical lens, are extremely inherently ableist. And it's something that if we're not having disabled students at the table and disabled people giving their input on how we're reevaluating our return, we're going to be leaving our disabled students and that experience entirely out of it. And perpetuating the notion that the academy was never meant for disability.
Thank you, Dan. I really am struck by two things that you said just now. This notion of the back and forth, and then you also talked about the loss of structure, which to me really exacerbates what COVID-19 has meant for disabled students, right? So I really appreciate you acknowledging those 2 points that to me that really stood out in your comments. Alonzo, I want you to jump in and share any pieces from your end working with undocumented students.
Absolutely, thank you. And I also echo, fellow panelists in Utah, to be much more specific about plays too. In Salt Lake City, a year ago, right before we went home for COVID, there was an earthquake. And Utah is not prepared to handle earthquakes. It was large, it wasn't completely devastating, but nonetheless, students were already in severe panic mode when we got the news a week later that we were gonna go home, right? So students have yet to recover from both the earthquake and going home. But in addition to that, I think we need to contextualize the fact that we are dealing with multiple crises, right? Like we're dealing with an increase in like white supremacist movements and, you know, anti-Black racism, xenophobia, you know, immigration. You know, right in the middle of the pandemic, it was when the Supreme Court announced the decision about DACA also, and how it's going to, you know, the Supreme Court is essentially going to not uphold DACA, but you know, it ruled that the way in which the government tried to get rid of DACA was unconstitutional. So DACA remains, but then there is a bunch of students now who are ineligible for DACA, right? So that's deferred action for childhood arrivals, which allows certain undocumented immigrants to be able to legally work in the US, as well as, you know, have a deferment from deportation, essentially. So our students are dealing with a lot, right? And then in addition to that, there's a lot of loss of families, loss of contact, loss of touch, right? So being a new professional on my campus too, I was immediately sent home and I've been able to return, but nonetheless, I'm really starting to build those relationships with the students that I work with, as well as the communities that I support, right? So it's been a lot, you know, to say the least.
Thank you so much for that. The multiple crises that you pointed out, I think is what really stays with me. And not just crises from like our government or racial violence or, you know, it's also, you mentioned the earthquake, right? And the fact that that also occurred, I think was just compounding effects of all of these pieces together. So I appreciate you sharing that. Toby, what are your thoughts?
So I call myself Negative Nancy about this whole thing. Because, you know, like when you ask, like, how has it affected? I mean, everything. It's been hard for me on all fronts. And like you were saying, I think it's just important to say that and acknowledge like all sides of ourselves, right? So, you know, just first me as a person, like to when all of this started, my son is in kindergarten. And everything shut down. And so having to suddenly homeschool a young child during a really important year of school was a lot for me. And his school wasn't prepared because that's the other thing. Like, you know, some schools quickly pivoted, as we were saying, and transition things, and they already had Chromebooks and, you know, all this stuff or whatever. But some schools didn't necessarily have that structure and everything in place. And so his school wasn't prepared. His teacher was in her retirement year, you know, so she was an older teacher. She was unable to do anything virtual. And so basically for him, the school just basically stopped. And so I was faced with the situation of having to also stop and research and become a kindergarten teacher, and, you know, plan a curriculum for him so that he didn't have too much that, you know, of being behind. And that was at the same time that I'm pivoting in my own university courses and, you know, and trying to move them online. And then my husband was a recruiter for an airline. So he lost his job eventually. And so it was just, you know, a mess. It was hard on everyone. And I think, honestly, we're just all still trying to survive at some level. You know, my father passed away this past fall. In this one academic year, I've had more death and grief than I've experienced in the last 5. You know what I'm saying? That in the last 5 years, I've had lost more people in this 1 year than I've lost in the last 5 years. And so the stress of it all, to be honest, kind of makes you not care about minor stuff. So I think first, just giving people space to just breathe and adjust is so important. And, you know, I don't know. I think as time moved on, it's been good and bad. So we figured out that like we could create these virtual spaces, and at some level, it's been great. We learned how to like create community. We could host virtual campus programs and speakers, and we could do virtual workouts and concerts, and, you know, and even beyond campus, like broadly in life, like we have verses and Pass the Mic and all this stuff that's like bringing us, you know, joy, entertainment. And I definitely think cultural centers have shown up for that. But essentially, in my opinion, doing what they've always done, being whatever students need them to be in the moment. Right. So they learned that you could do a Zoom chat or a good old fashioned phone call and still reach students. People were doing virtual office hours. I mean, you had universities like, you know, when you look at what Purdue and Indiana, like some of those cultural centers, we're able to still kind of create these programs like a Black History Month where, every day there's still something going on, that type of thing, that was basically the vibe on campus. So, they've done a lot. But I can't end without saying that I do think this pivot has become a culture of too muchness. And so now we're expecting that everything can just go back to normal, that we can, or we got it down so we can pack on meetings and pack in assignments. And there's a kind of a lack of appreciation for the cumulative effect of this year. And so, all the virtual connections that have been good, we're still dealing with all this death and grief and frustration and anger from, all of the racial trauma and to a point where we probably need to give students a break and we need to give ourselves a break. So cut back on the assignments. They don't want to complete them. We don't want to grade them, so let's just be real. We're tired, we're exhausted. So I don't want to applaud the culture of overwork that is always put on these center staff, whether it's on campus or now virtually, right? That this idea that we've got to do it all if nobody else is going to do it. So we've got to pack it in and do it. Because right now everybody is struggling and that's just too much. If you look at people, as the staff and faculty on our campuses as people, it's too much even for them.
I really appreciate that, Toby. So I want to zoom out a bit, and you've already touched on this a lot in some of your remarks, but I wondered if there was other pieces that you could name here. So I want to zoom out and talk about cultural centers more broadly. So in your past professional experiences, Toby, you've directed cultural centers at both the University of Maryland as well as Penn State University. You've also engaged in research about the role of cultural centers. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, help the audience understand maybe what you've learned from both your practical as well as your research-based work on cultural centers and the importance of them, especially in this particular climate. But then also, I think I love the part you added on the end, whereas we expect cultural centers to be all and do all for everyone, right? And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that piece too.
Yeah, with nothing.
Yes.
Resources.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you talk about creating space of true and authentic cultural and racial mattering, that's cultural centers, right? That's what cultural centers have been organically doing for, since they came into existence, in the late 60s, 70s. But if you go back to the, my favorite education scholar, who we rarely learn about in the field of education. You learn about him in African American studies, but very rarely are people talking about Carter G. Woodson in education, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. But when you go back to Carter G. Woodson's classic work on the miseducation of the Negro, and how impossible it is for minoritized young people to learn the skills that will be essential for them to become the leaders that we need in their own communities, right? How unlikely it is that they'll learn skills of resistance or freedom seeking or liberation in classrooms or educational settings that are built on a belief that they are less than and deviant, right? Then the cultural education and identity development and the racial justice training and work and everything that goes on in cultural centers, you understand just how critical those spaces are. And the other thing is, I think if you understand freedom as having the power to just live your full life, be yourself, love yourself, laugh, be comfortable, stumble without judgment, get help without judgment, be loud, silly, critical, mad, creative, innovative, non-conforming, then you understand that cultural centers are one of the few spaces on a college campus where minoritized students can be free, right? Where freedom is real and operationalized. And so, and I honestly, like I said, I often contest this idea of just students, because if you believe in community, then you believe everybody in the community matters, right? So I say the same thing for staff, right? So when I think about my time working in university cultural centers and what that space was for us as staff, doing the work, everyone in the space has a level of comfort and it feels good, you know, whether you're a student or a professional. And so that initial foundation of like cultural comfort and the power to be yourselves and allows everyone in the space to do some pretty incredible work. And so, you know, despite the very little resources, you know, I think that most institutions provide centers. That's why you're able to see such incredible stuff still be able to come out, because first we're in a space where we're comfortable and we're able to think strategically, creatively, to innovate, et cetera, and still create these initiatives and interventions and programs and events that outpace some departments that have much more staff and money than a cultural center has.
Great, thank you for that, providing that context for cultural centers. And I love the part you said about like just the freedom, just the space where you're affirmed, I think is also really, really critical. So I appreciate your perspective there, Toby. Dan, so you work with disabled students in your role at Miami University. My sense is that these students often feel invisible. I'm wondering if you can talk more about what is it that makes them feel this way, and specifically the challenges that disabled students are facing related to COVID-19.
Sure. You're absolutely right, Stephen. I think that the precipice of this is that disabled students and their access needs are constantly felt as if they are an afterthought. And that's what's making them feel invisible. That what their needs are is the fact that it's too much work. It's non-disabled people having to labor over making sure disabled people feel included. And that's not what disabled people are asking for. We're asking for access to everything everybody else has. Disabled students are sharing that, you know, through our stereotypes of disability, that their lives are pitied, tragic, and burdensome. Like, the virtual world has added more layers for certain members of our community. When we're going to event after event after event that's in a virtual world, for many folks, that may be a very inaccessible experience. So it's, you know, what are we doing to recognize that experience and trying to reduce as many access barriers as we can? The environment, are we, you know, the number of times I've worked with students that say, you know, I haven't been able to attend this event because I wasn't asked what I would need to fully participate. Those are the things that we're hearing. And those are the things that COVID has highlighted, where, you know, we got comfortable in our physical space and how to provide access. And when students are, you know, losing their support systems, they're now in isolation. They don't know how to be in community in the ways that they have in the past. It's recreating that. It has been something that our students feel as though they are being isolated, and it makes them feel even more invisible than they already have. The last thing I would just say is, disabled students have been asking for some of the accommodations that we've been able to implement during COVID for years. This is not new, these accommodation requests, the ability to be remote, and a lot of our students, this is finally a liberatory experience, and the push back to normalcy for those students in particular is incredibly violent. It's incredibly intrusive on their body-mind, and it's something that those are the students that we need to be centering in our experience. And those are the students that are feeling incredibly invisible when we're saying, oh, our new normal is going to be wonderful. Those are the students that we really need to be tapping into to better understand how we can bridge the gap and enhance the university experience.
Thank you so much, Dan. I just want to reiterate one of the things that Dan said, which to me was really powerful. I wasn't asked what I needed to fully participate, which seems like a very small but meaningful and significant thing, right? So just as an aside, I appreciate that comment, Dan. I signed up today to review proposals for the ASHE conference, and one of the questions at the end spoke to that point, like, what do you need in order to make the reviewing process more accessible? And so to me, it goes a long way. And I think just hearing you say that, Dan, reminds us of the significance of what it even takes to even ask for what you need, right, as a disabled student. So I just want to really commend you for pointing that out. So Dre, I want to bring you into this conversation too, and I think some of your opening comments have gotten at this already. But I'm wondering if you can talk about, given your context at Davidson specifically and the particular equity work that you do, what are the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has like surfaced? What issues has it surfaced for the students and colleagues that you work with?
Sure. Yeah, to be really honest, I could talk a whole hour about what those things are, but I can talk about some short things, what I've seen come across my desk. So I already alluded to just structural access issues our students are having to engage with our campus in a virtual capacity. One of the early things that I had to navigate, I also do bias response as a part of my work. When we moved to Zoom, I had to learn about virtual bias in a different way, right? So Zoom bombing was a really, really big thing. There was a lot of flippant comments from faculty around access issue and participation in the classroom that also were building upon various types of microaggressions around different identities. So that was a big one I had to navigate very quickly. I also noticed very quickly who could, some of my students moved into frontline workers. So I remember vividly one of my male students, former athlete, because he went back home, he immediately had to start helping financially with the family, was working in a grocery store while also being, working virtually, being in school on campus. And so navigating that safety, PPE, things like that. For me personally, as we moved into the pandemic, I also, my coordinator decided to move on from the role. So I immediately became understaffed. I immediately became a one-person center, still am in some ways, and trying to recognize how do I get my capacity up in an environment where we're a hiring freeze. I just, luckily this week, if you follow me on Facebook, just got approval to hire back. But what that's meant is that as I'm trying to care for and support students of all the needs that are going on, I'm also working very closely alone to help my students, my colleagues catch up on racism. So as I facetiously talk about, some people are ready to stop reading Beverly D'Angelo and actually do something, but didn't know where to start. And so that also became my work, is to help the campus, especially as student-facing folks, move forward with a lot of equity issues. As I mentioned before, our Asian American students at Davidson had already started some initial demands around doing all kinds of things for more equity on campus in fall of 19. They have just, because of what happened in Atlanta, that has exacerbated even to bigger things. And so, and I agree with them. So we're navigating not only that, but also still trying to pick up on existing demands that our Black students have put out the year before that. And so I think for me, it's been, again, all over the place. As I keep saying, things that were already challenging. So even like building renaming, basic access for people to just survive as students were already there. But I think what COVID did in some, hopefully, I hate the word positive, some useful ways, is that it put a big spotlight. What is different now is I have the ear of our senior team that says, oh, let's do something for real. What do you need? And so the ways that I've seen them respond, unfortunately, to not be seen as a horribly oppressive campus has been beneficial for me as an equity officer on campus. But it took a pandemic, and it took so many other major exacerbating issues to finally get the movement that I've been wanting for 3 years now.
Thank you for that, Dre. So the panelists thus far have been talking about how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated equity issues for students with minoritized identities. So one particularly vulnerable population is undocumented students. And so Alonso, I'm wondering if you can tell us what differences you've seen in your work with undocumented students since COVID-19.
Absolutely. So for me, this also brings up a lot of questions or the realities mostly about how the lives of our students, specifically undocumented students for me, are so entrenched with policy, right? So for example, when the CARES Act happened, undocumented students were not part of it, right? So our students did not get stimulus checks, and most of them, or actually, well, our undocumented students, all of them did not qualify for any on-campus resources, right? In terms of, at least from that pocket of money that came from the government, right? So So it is a reality that our undocumented students are being left behind, right? And fortunately on our campus, we have a great team of leaders who were able to, bring in resources for our undocumented students in particular, but nationally, that's not the trend, right? Like it's a population that's being forgotten. So I think that's really important for us to like remember and bring up. Also, our students who are undocumented mostly live in multi-generational households, and they also had to step in and become either like providers, or especially those with DACA who did have access to a stimulus check, had to step in and be the breadwinners for the family, and because people were losing their jobs, right? Or in other instances, undocumented immigrants were deemed essential workers with no status and no benefits, but still essentialized workers when it came to either agriculture or facilities and cleaning hospitals, etc. But that's something that's also not recognized. To bring it back to my college, one of the most impactful experiences for me was seeing undocumented alumni return to seek resources, right? People who had already graduated came back to seek medical resources, people with food insecurity, people without houses were asking for how to, get access to some of that, to those resources. And that was really impactful for me and spoke volumes about the work that we do here and the importance of our centers, of course, but also the reality that our undocumented immigrant community is being highly impacted by, everything that's happening with COVID, plus all the, policies that are being enacted.
So thank you. So a follow-up question to you, Alonzo, but I also want to bring in Dan for this particular one too. So in your respective roles, both of you worked fiercely to bring about change. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your advocacy specifically looks like in your communities, as well as in your virtual spaces. So Alonzo, why don't you start, and then Dan, if you want to go next after.
Absolutely, thank you for that question. So in addition to trying to find resources on campus to support students, we have actively partnered with nonprofits across the state, and specifically in the city, to be able to bring about resources for undocumented immigrants, right? So for example, a concrete example I can provide you is that we partner with an artist who created a print, and we were able to reproduce a print and be able to sell that or use that as a fundraising item, where we were able to bring about money for undocumented immigrants who did not qualify for the CARES Act, right? So it's being really creative about how we use our resources to be able to, multiply them and be able to provide them to the larger community, right? Another example that I can provide you is being really intentional about how we use our institutional funds to support our community, right? So instead of catering from like a big, maybe like, company, why don't we go to an immigrant-owned restaurant, right? And why don't we cater from them, right? As one example. Or when we're bringing about like, supplies for events, why don't we turn to like, again, local folks and from minoritized communities specifically to be able to use those institutional resources to create that change in our communities? Because, as Toby mentioned, it's not just about the students, it's also about our communities at large.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alonzo. I'm thinking about disability and advocacy are closely tied together in many ways. But the digital realm, when I think about how much of a shift we've had to make, disability advocacy has been in the digital space for years, forever, much longer than folks even acknowledge and give credit to. And we've recently gotten this recognition of when everything had to go remote, the disability community was set up in the digital space, was set up on social, and was able to keep our connections, and not only surviving, but now we were thriving in these virtual spaces. And it really elevated our community to a new level. And it really gave models to other communities in ways of the virtual work itself, and advocacy, and how we're looking at community care and collective community care, and like all these places and spaces that we've been doing and giving our peers, our disabled peers, for many years, because most folks may not be able to leave their home, do not have access to transportation, are in virtual spaces just for the socialization that non-disabled folks takes as a privilege. This is where disabled folks were the ones who knew how to navigate this space in this world of isolation. And now everyone's trying to take that away. And we're trying to say, we need this space to remain.
Thank you both for those responses. I appreciate them. So Dre and Toby, let me bring you both in here. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your various social identities and how they play a role in your cultural center work. Toby, do you want to start?
Okay. I was like, I don't know who's starting. Well, I mean, I identify as a woman, you know, with she, her pronouns. I'm African-American. I'm from a working class family. I'm first gen college student. I'm a Gen X hip hop generation member, right? And I do think I pull on probably all of those sensibilities as I do my work, whether it was, you know, when I was working in cultural centers or, you know, now as a faculty member. But I also think I do this work because of those identities. They kind of drive what matters to me. But like I said before, I mean, I don't see myself as part, I see myself as part of the community. So like not separate from students. So there's no like student administrator paradigm in my mind. There never has been. And, you know, when I look back at a lot of the work that I was able to do in cultural centers and how successful so many of the things that we created were, I think it was because of that, because we all had love for the stuff that we were doing. So like a long time ago, I contested this idea of like student centeredness as being like asking students what they need and then giving it to them. I think that's a real easy cop out. That, you know, student governance and student centeredness are different for me. I don't think it's students' jobs to come up with interventions and program ideas. That's our job. So, you know, for me, student centeredness is about being close to students, to have their experiences and their perspectives centered in your work. So you talk to them, engage with them, you to better know their experience, to understand their experience. But it's up to us to, you know, like to kind of come up with the answers. So when I directed centers, I did a lot of like just letting students talk and hearing them. And so, but I was really adamant about like, stop wearing affinity group leaders out, having them run around campus, planning all the cultural programs, because that's the institution's responsibility. So even the most, you know, talented student leader must be allowed to just be a student sometimes. And that gets back to the thing that I was talking about with freedom. Like, right, because we don't allow them to be free. So here they are laboring while other students are learning and relaxing, right? Black and brown students and Asian American students deserve to play Frisbee on the lawn or chill over coffee or debate a book, just like everybody else, instead of like running around campus trying to raise money for their next program with, you know, with their hands out. So there's professional development value there, but it for them, you know, like I do see that they gain from having those experiences and they develop professionally, but it's too much sometimes. So for me, it's much more a critical charge for higher ed professionals to be asked to know and understand students and then translate that into need, into a program that can speak to their experience. And a part of that for me is allowing myself to be a community member. So I mind their experience, but I also mind my own experience. I mind their interests, but also my interests, community interests, and establish, you know, programs that speak to everyone on campus, to students, to faculty, to staff, to local community members, right? Right. So I'm trying to feed everyone. And I do think that comes from, you know, probably that Southern cultural sensibility that we share, that we take care of the whole family, everyone in the community. When my ancestors were enslaved, you had 70-year-olds trying to learn how to read after emancipation just to achieve that goal of like being able to read before they die, right? Education mattered to everybody, and it still does. It still matters to the local community that surrounds the institution. So I see what I create as sustenance for everyone on campus, because we all have voids. We all have things that we need to develop in ourselves and things that we need to know and more that we need to become. So, just seeing us as a community at large, I think is really, really important. And that I drive from my social identities.
I mean, ditto in many ways. Yeah, I mean, for me, what's on my mind, I'll give my shopping list of my identities. Black, queer woman. I like to describe myself as fluidly able. I grapple with mental health stuff and what have you, and sometimes that's okay. Sometimes there's challenges there. I am not a practicing Christian, although I was raised as such, and I'm at a Christian college. So for me, I mean, that's one reason why all those identities is the reason why it took me 20 years to come back South, right? For me, in the work that I do, I deeply remember and ingrained what it was like for me to grow up in Texas, in an environment where I didn't see anybody like me ever, right? And not having complicated conversations. I had early memories of me having to check my Blackness at one door to have my queerness thrive in one space, and then the queerness had to be checked to have the Blackness thrive. And so a big part of the reason why I do the work that I do and what I hope that I do at Davidson is I don't want a student to have to check anything, right? So it's up to me to work with my students, my campus, my colleagues to create spaces that people can be their whole selves no matter where they are, right? And I very much do believe that there are times in which we should center Blackness and queerness and other identities that are important, that all those things are mattering at once. That's hard work, but I think both of those are very, very necessary for me. I do want to name that how students respond to me and my identities differs based on the spaces or the work that I'm doing, right? I'll be real honest, when I got to Davidson in a different way that I've seen in other campuses, Black students were happy about that. Black women in this role, they were happy and affirmed. I had some students that were non-Black that had a little bit of, I don't know about her and her politics, where is she sitting? So there was a lot of inquiry of what are my full racial politics, right? Same thing happened in a queer space. It is often the case that people forget my queerness. I had hard conversations with students and my colleagues. Yes, I am also queer, like that is who I am as well. And yes, I can do other things besides just be the Black person taking care of the Black students, right? Like, so I think one of the hard pushes of my work is to help my campus reimagine what this work is in a different way. And so I think, I'll be honest, the archetypes of the angry Black woman, the difficult Black woman, because I'm so strong in my voice, are very, very much there. I also feel like I am also given what I call a newer archetype of the Olivia Pope, right? Like this whole scandal, handle it, fix it, put on your superhero cape, save the campus from racism or other isms. That is also a part of it. And so for me, it's required a lot of good boundaries, which I think has been really good modeling for my staff and my students. I've been really clear with my students lately, be like similar to what Toby said, be a student, have joy. The work, a lot of the labor of the institutional changing, it's not just on you. Come and check me and your colleagues. How can we use our institutional power to do this alongside with you, right? It's not all on you. Please enjoy your time in college, right? And so I think that's been a lot of the work that I've been navigating in this really small elite Christian world, if you will.
Thank you both for that, for sharing more about who you are and how your identities play a role in your work. I really appreciate that. And I think the audience really, it was helpful for the audience to see that too. So I appreciate that. We have just a few more minutes left. So I just want to ask one question from the audience, and maybe one of you could respond to this question, and then I'll close this out. But TJ Jurian posed a question around what are one or two policy and or practice shifts that your campus or department has instituted that you hope to maintain long-term because of positive impacts on equity, and or which ones do you want to undo as soon as possible? So maybe one or two of you might have a response to that question.
Well, I think, I'll agree with Dan about that. I hope that out of this year, we've learned our capacity around virtual remote flexibility for everyone, and so I know for me, I also have serious health challenges. I have lupus, and there was probably a month, because this year also took us, like, if you have health problems, you weren't able to go to your doctors. And so there was a period where my health declined significantly because I wasn't able to get the health care that I was used to getting. And I was immobile. I couldn't walk for probably 3 weeks or so, and I am bedridden. And but the ability, because we were virtual, it really didn't matter. No one knew. No one. I didn't even have talked to anybody about it. Like, it's something, a conversation that I had to have, because I was just able to flow, I'm saying, whatever through it. And sometimes your frustration, your personal frustration with the things going on in your life, make it where you don't want to have to constantly have a conversation with somebody about, what problems you're having or what you can or can't do and why you can or can't do it. And, all that stuff. It's just re-traumatizing you. And so that flexibility, I hope that, as Dan was saying, in our push to move back to campus and move back to so-called normal, that we embrace what all of us that have experienced life-changing events know as new normal, and create new ways of being and new flexibilities for everyone on campus, students, faculty, staff, to be able to just do the work and get it done and do it great, but have the flexibilities that we need to honor our humanity.
Thank you so much for that, Toby. So I just want to thank you again to Toby, Dan, Dre, and Alonso for such a stimulating conversation for today's first ASHE Presidential Webinar. Just as a reminder, these webinars will be occurring bi-monthly. And I want to take a few minutes now to share with you my enthusiasm for the remaining 3 webinars. So please join us for our next one on June 24th, where panelists will discuss how community colleges and minority serving institutions bridge the divide between the academy and the community. Following that, the next one will focus on sustainability and equity and justice and sustainability education, which will be on August 12th with Noah Dresner, Oren Pismani-Levy, Christina Torres, and Carrot Wang. And then finally, in October 14th, we will close with our 4th and final webinar on the placing of gender equity in higher education with TJ Jurian, Layla McLeod, Keon McGuire, and Z Nicolazzo. So again, I want to thank the panelists so much for the labor and time that they invested today. I want to just close this first panel with a reminder of something that Toby said at the outset, which is making space to fully include our truths. So I hope as you leave this panel today that you remember this and that you make space for those in your lives, those who are around you, to fully include their truths and all of the truth that exists for them and enable them to live as their full selves, because that's essentially what we need to counter the equity issues that plague us. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us for today's first panel, and I look forward to seeing you on June 24th.
Thank you.